The moment Shanice Odom stepped through the tall glass doors of Vespre, she felt every eye in the dining room turn toward her, like she had just walked into a room where she was not supposed to exist. She was holding the small hand of her 7-year-old daughter Zuri, and in that hand was a folded piece of paper on which Zuri had written in careful purple crayon letters the words, "Mommy's birthday dinner." Shanice had saved for 11 months to be here. She had skipped lunches, walked instead of taking the bus, patched the same pair of work shoes 3 times, and stitched the torn lining of her one good coat by hand at 2 in the morning after her second shift. And now, as the hostess looked her up and down with a slow, deliberate smile that did not reach her eyes, Shanice already knew what was coming. She just did not know yet that the woman sitting 3 tables away, sipping quietly from a glass of red wine, was about to change the entire course of her life. Because what was about to happen inside Vespre that night would not just be a humiliation. It would be the beginning of a reckoning. And 1 year later, Shanice Odom would walk back through those same glass doors, not as a customer, not as a guest, but as the one person the entire restaurant could not survive without. This is her story, and you are going to want to hear every single word of it. Shanice Odom was 31 years old, and she had been tired for as long as she could remember. She lived in a small second-floor apartment on the east side of Charleston, South Carolina, in a building where the hallway lights flickered every 3rd second and the radiator hissed like it was angry at the world. The apartment had 2 rooms, a bathroom the size of a closet, and a window that looked out onto a parking lot where the same 3 cars had been sitting broken and abandoned for as long as she had lived there. But it was hers. And more importantly, it was Zuri's. And Shanice had spent every waking hour of the last 7 years making sure that her daughter never once had to wonder whether the rent would be paid, whether the lights would stay on, or whether there would be food on the table when she came home from school. She worked 2 jobs. From 5 in the morning until 1 in the afternoon, she was a prep cook at a diner called Marlene's off Highway 17, a small, yellow-walled place that had been serving grits and eggs and buttered biscuits to truckers and construction workers since before Shanice was born. She chopped onions until her fingers went numb. She peeled potatoes until the skin under her fingernails turned raw. She stood over sizzling flat tops in the middle of July when the air conditioning gave out, and she never once complained, because Marlene had hired her when nobody else would, back when Shanice was 23 and pregnant and had nowhere else to turn. Then, from 3 in the afternoon until 9 at night, she worked at a dry cleaner 2 blocks away, pressing shirts and folding sheets and hanging suits for men who tipped in loose change if they tipped at all. By the time she got home, Zuri was usually asleep on the couch, curled up under the crocheted blanket that Miss Thelma from downstairs had made her the year she turned 5. Miss Thelma was 68 years old, a retired school teacher with a slow smile and a soft voice, and she watched Zuri every afternoon for the price of a hot meal and whatever Shanice could spare at the end of the month. Sometimes it was $20. Sometimes it was a bag of groceries. Sometimes it was just a long hug and a whispered "thank you" at the door. And Miss Thelma never once asked for more. Shanice would carry Zuri to bed, brush her hair back from her forehead, kiss her 1 time on the temple, and then sit at the small kitchen table with a cup of tea that was more hot water than tea, and she would open a notebook. In that notebook, she wrote down every dollar she spent, every dollar she earned, and every dollar she saved. And in the back of that notebook, on a page she had folded down at the corner, was a number. That number was the price of dinner for 2 at Vespre, the finest restaurant in Charleston, the kind of place where senators ate on Saturday nights and where the wine list had leather covers and gold-embossed lettering. And underneath that number was a date: Zuri's 7th birthday. Because Zuri had asked for one thing only. She had seen Vespre in a magazine at the doctor's office, a photograph of a chandelier hanging over a white tablecloth with a small silver bell on it. And she had turned to her mother and asked, in the quiet way that 7-year-olds ask big questions, whether they could go there one day. And Shanice, without hesitation, had said yes. Because she had made a promise to herself years ago that her daughter would never grow up believing there were rooms in this world she was not allowed to walk into. She did not know yet that some rooms are built precisely to make people like her believe exactly that. The reservation had been the hardest part. Shanice had called Vespre on a Tuesday morning during her 15-minute break at the diner, standing in the alley behind the dumpster with her phone pressed hard against her ear so she could hear over the traffic. The woman who answered had a voice like polished glass, smooth and cold. And she had asked Shanice 3 separate times to spell her last name. O-D-O-M. Odom. Yes, ma'am, for 2. Saturday the 14th, 7 o'clock. Yes, ma'am, I understand there is a dress code. Yes, ma'am, I understand the minimum spend. Yes, ma'am. Thank you, ma'am. She had hung up the phone and stood in that alley for a long moment, staring at the graffiti on the brick wall across from her. And she had felt something she had not felt in a very long time. She had felt proud. She had done it. She had made a reservation at Vespre for her daughter's birthday, and nobody was going to take that away from her. She had spent the next 2 weeks preparing. She had washed and pressed her one good dress, a navy blue thing she had bought at a consignment shop 3 years earlier for a job interview she did not get. She had polished her shoes with a rag and a small tin of black polish she borrowed from the shoe repairman on the corner. She had taken Zuri to a discount store and let her pick out a dress from the clearance rack. And Zuri had chosen a pale yellow one with tiny white flowers embroidered along the hem, and she had spun in it in front of the mirror for almost 10 full minutes, laughing. And Shanice had stood in the doorway of the fitting room with her hand over her mouth so that Zuri would not see her cry. On the morning of the 14th, Shanice woke up at 4:30. She made Zuri pancakes with the last of the flour and the last of the eggs, and she cut them into the shape of hearts with a butter knife. She braided Zuri's hair into 2 neat plaits with yellow ribbons at the ends. She ironed the yellow dress one more time, even though it did not need ironing. And at 6:45, she and Zuri walked down the stairs of their building, hand in hand, and stepped out into the warm Charleston evening. They did not take a taxi. They could not afford one. They walked the 2 miles from their apartment to Vespre, slowly, carefully, so that Zuri's white shoes would not get scuffed and so that Shanice's dress would not wrinkle. And as they walked, Zuri looked up at her mother every few minutes and squeezed her hand. And Shanice squeezed back, and neither one of them said a single word, because there were no words. There was only the walk and the promise, and the small silver bell that was waiting for them somewhere in a room they had never been allowed to enter. They arrived at Vespre at exactly 6:58. The hostess at Vespre was a young woman named Bethany, and she had been working at the restaurant for 11 months. She was 24 years old, blonde, and had a smile that she had practiced in the mirror until it looked exactly the way she wanted it to look. Which is to say, it looked warm from a distance and cold up close. She stood behind a tall wooden podium at the entrance of the restaurant, and in front of her was a leather-bound reservation book with gold lettering on the cover. And next to that was a small crystal vase with a single white orchid in it. When Shanice and Zuri walked through the front doors, Bethany looked up. And in the half-second before she rearranged her face, Shanice saw it. She saw the flicker, the tiny, involuntary shift in Bethany's expression that said, quite clearly, "You are not supposed to be here." It was not hatred. It was not even dislike. It was something colder than that. It was surprise. The surprise of someone who has been trained to expect a certain kind of person at a certain kind of door, and who has just seen the wrong kind of person walk through it. Shanice had seen that flicker 1,000 times in her life. She had seen it at bank counters and at car dealerships and at the front desk of Zuri's pediatrician's office. She knew exactly what it meant, and she knew exactly what came next. "Good evening," Shanice said, keeping her voice steady and her chin lifted. "I have a reservation. Odom, 7 o'clock. Bethany's smile did not move. It stayed exactly where it was, like a photograph. She looked down at the reservation book, and she ran her finger down the page slowly, very slowly, as if she were reading a language she was not entirely fluent in. "Odom," she said. "Odom, Odom." "Yes," Shanice said. "For 2. Bethany's fingers stopped. She looked up, and now the smile was different. It was tighter. It was smaller. It was the smile of someone who had been given a piece of very bad news that she was about to deliver to somebody else. "I'm so sorry," Bethany said. "I don't see your reservation." Shanice felt her stomach drop. Not because she was surprised, but because she was not surprised. Because some part of her, some small and quiet part of her that lived in the back of her mind, had been expecting this from the moment she made the call. "I called 2 weeks ago," Shanice said. "I spoke to a woman. She confirmed it. 7 o'clock, Saturday the 14th. "I understand," Bethany said. "But I don't see anything under that name." Zuri looked up at her mother. She did not understand what was happening, but she understood, in the way that children understand these things, that something was wrong. She squeezed her mother's hand tighter. Shanice took a slow breath. She was not going to make a scene. She was not going to raise her voice. She was going to solve this problem the way she had solved every other problem in her life. Calmly, quietly, and with the patience of a woman who had been told no 1,000 times and had learned to keep asking anyway. "Would you check again, please?" she said. "Under Shanice Odom, Shanice. Bethany checked again, or at least, she moved her finger down the page again. Shanice could not tell whether she was actually reading it or just pretending to. "I'm sorry," Bethany said. "There's nothing here." And that was when Geneva Hart looked up from her table. Geneva Hart was 67 years old, and she had been sitting at table 7 at Vespre every Saturday night for the last 9 years. She always sat alone. She always ordered the same thing, which was a small green salad, a piece of grilled fish, and a single glass of red wine that she nursed for the entire meal. She always tipped exactly 30%, and she always paid in cash, from a small leather wallet that she kept in the inside pocket of a dark gray coat that she had owned for longer than most of the staff had been alive. The staff at Vespre did not know very much about Geneva. They knew that she was a regular. They knew that she was polite. They knew that she never sent food back and never asked to speak to the manager. What they did not know was that Geneva Hart had, until 7 years ago, owned the 3 most successful restaurants in the state of Georgia. What they did not know was that she had sold those restaurants for an amount of money that would have made every single person in the room at Vespre that night stop what they were doing and stare. And what they did not know, most importantly, was that Geneva Hart had grown up watching her own mother work 11 hours a day in the cafeteria of an elementary school in rural Mississippi, and that she had spent every day of her adult life looking for the woman who reminded her most of her mother. That night, at table 7, sipping quietly from her glass of red wine, Geneva Hart looked up, and she saw Shanice Odom. She saw the navy blue dress that had been pressed one too many times. She saw the shoes that had been polished until they shone. She saw the yellow ribbons in the little girl's hair. She saw the way the mother held the daughter's hand, and she saw the way the hostess was smiling at them. And she recognized that smile immediately, because she had seen it on the faces of 100 hostesses at 100 restaurants in 100 cities over the course of her long and quiet life. Geneva Hart set down her wineglass, and she watched. After 10 minutes of standing at the podium, after Shanice had shown Bethany the confirmation number she had written down in her notebook, after Bethany had reluctantly called over the general manager, a tall woman with a sharp jaw and a sharper voice named Victoria, Shanice and Zuri were finally led into the dining room. But they were not led to a table by the window, where the candles flickered and the couples leaned in close to each other. They were not led to a table near the fireplace, where the light was warm and the flowers were fresh. They were led all the way to the back of the restaurant, past the kitchen doors, to a small two-top table that had been squeezed between a service station and the entrance to the bathrooms. The table was uneven. The chairs were mismatched, and the candle on the table had not been lit. "Here you are," Victoria said, pulling out a chair with the tips of her fingers as if she did not want to touch it. "Your server will be with you shortly." Shanice sat down. She helped Zuri into her chair. She placed the folded paper that said "Mommy's birthday dinner" on the table between them. And she smiled at her daughter, and she said, in the calmest voice she could manage, "Isn't this nice, baby? Isn't this a nice table?" Zuri looked around. She looked at the door to the kitchen, which was swinging open and shut every 30 seconds. She looked at the sign for the bathrooms, which was directly above her mother's head. She looked at the busboy, who walked past their table without so much as a glance in their direction. And then she looked at her mother, and she smiled. Because she was 7 years old, and because her mother was smiling, and she said, "Yes, Mommy, it's really nice." The server did not come for 22 minutes. Shanice counted. When the server finally did come, a young man with a bow tie and a tight smile, he handed them 2 menus without making eye contact and asked if they would like water. Shanice said yes. He nodded. He walked away. He did not come back for another 16 minutes. At table 7, Geneva Hart was still watching. When the server finally returned, Shanice ordered carefully. She had studied the menu for 2 weeks. She knew exactly what she wanted, and she knew exactly what she could afford. She ordered the roasted chicken for herself, which was the least expensive entree on the menu. She ordered the pasta with butter for Zuri, which was the only thing on the children's menu that did not have something unfamiliar in it. And she ordered 1 glass of house white wine, because she had decided months ago that she would let herself have 1 glass of wine on her daughter's birthday, and she was not going to change her mind now. The server wrote down the order without looking at her. He collected the menus. He walked away. Zuri unfolded her paper. "Mommy, can I read you what I wrote?" "Of course, baby." Zuri cleared her throat. She sat up very straight in her chair, and she read, in the careful, halting voice of a 7-year-old who has practiced this moment in her bedroom every night for 2 weeks. "Dear Mommy, happy birthday. I love you more than the ocean, and more than the sky, and more than all the stars in the whole world. You are the best, Mommy. You work so hard, and you are so pretty, and you make the best pancakes. I hope you have the best dinner ever. Love, Zuri. Shanice reached across the table. She took her daughter's small hand in hers, and she smiled, and she did not cry, because she had promised herself that she would not cry, no matter what happened, no matter what anybody said, no matter how they were treated. Thank you, baby, she whispered. That is the most beautiful thing anybody has ever written to me. At table 7, Geneva Hart wiped a single tear from the corner of her eye. The food came 38 minutes after it had been ordered. The chicken was cold. The pasta was overcooked. The glass of wine had been poured to less than half full. Shanice did not send anything back. She cut Zuri's pasta into small pieces. She poured some of her own water into Zuri's glass because Zuri's glass was empty and the server had not returned. And she began to eat. She had been eating for less than 5 minutes when Victoria appeared at the table. "Ma'am," Victoria said. Her voice was quiet, but it carried. "I'm going to have to ask you to step outside with me for a moment." Shanice looked up. She set down her fork. "Is there a problem? If you could just come with me, please." "My daughter is eating her dinner." "Ma'am, please." Shanice looked at Zuri. Zuri was looking down at her plate very quietly, the way she did when she was trying to become invisible. Shanice reached across the table and touched her daughter's hand. "I'll be right back, baby. You keep eating. I love you." She stood up. She followed Victoria across the dining room. Every eye in the restaurant followed them. She did not look at any of them. She kept her chin up. She kept her back straight. She walked out of that dining room the way she had walked into it, which was to say, like a woman who had every right to be there. Victoria led her to a small alcove near the front door. She turned to face Shanice, and in a voice that was polished and rehearsed and had clearly been used many times before, she said the following words. "Ma'am, I've received some complaints from other guests about the noise level at your table. In order to protect the experience of our other diners, I'm going to have to ask you to leave." Shanice stared at her. "The noise level?" "Yes. My daughter was reading me a birthday card. She was whispering." "I understand, but I've had complaints, and I have to think about the other guests." "We haven't finished our dinner. I paid for that dinner." "I would be happy to comp your meal, but I need you to leave. Now, please. Quietly." Shanice took a breath. She looked at Victoria for a long, long moment. And then, without another word, she turned around and she walked back across that dining room to her daughter, and she said, "Baby, we're going to go home now." Zuri looked up. She did not ask why. She did not cry. She simply nodded, and she picked up her folded paper, and she slid down from her chair, and she took her mother's hand. And together, hand in hand, they walked out of Vespre, past the tables, past the flickering candles, past the couples leaning in close, past the fireplace and the fresh flowers and the leather-bound reservation book with the gold lettering, past every eye in that dining room, which was on them, and none of which met theirs. And as they walked past table 7, Geneva Hart stood up. Shanice made it exactly 12 steps outside the front door of Vespre before her legs began to shake. She stopped on the sidewalk under a street lamp, and she knelt down in front of her daughter, and she put her hands on Zuri's small shoulders. "Baby," she said. "Baby, look at me. Are you okay?" Zuri nodded. Her eyes were huge. Her lips were pressed together very tightly. "I'm so sorry," Shanice whispered. "I'm so sorry. Baby, I am so sorry." "Mommy," Zuri said, "did we do something wrong?" And that was the moment when Shanice Odom, who had promised herself that she would not cry, felt the first tear roll down her cheek. Because in the entire history of the world, there had never been a question that broke her heart more completely than that one. Because the answer was no. The answer was no, baby. You did not do anything wrong. And I did not do anything wrong. And yet here we are, standing on a sidewalk in our best clothes, holding hands, and we are not allowed to eat our dinner. "No, baby," she said. "We didn't do anything wrong." She stood up. She wiped her face. She took Zuri's hand, and she began to walk. She had walked less than a block when she heard the voice behind her. "Excuse me." Shanice turned around. Standing on the sidewalk, in a dark gray coat that was buttoned all the way up to the neck, was an older woman. She was holding a small leather wallet in one hand and a business card in the other. Her hair was silver. Her eyes were kind. And she was looking at Shanice the way a person looks at someone they have been waiting to meet for a very long time. "My name is Geneva Hart," the woman said. "I was sitting at the table by the window. I saw what happened. And I would very much like to speak with you, if you would be willing to hear me out." Shanice looked at the business card. Then she looked at the woman. And then she said, in a voice that was steadier than she felt, "I'm listening." Geneva Hart did not waste time. Standing there on the sidewalk under the street lamp, with the sound of traffic behind her and the lights of Vespre glowing coldly in the distance, she told Shanice the following things. She told her that she was a retired restaurateur, that she had owned 3 restaurants in Georgia, that she had sold those restaurants 7 years ago, and that she had spent the last 7 years running a program called Second Table, which was a free culinary mentorship program for working adults who had never been given the chance to learn. She told her that Second Table was not a scholarship. It was not charity. It was a job. A real job with a real salary and real benefits and real housing if it was needed. She told her that the program lasted 12 months, that it required 6 days a week of training, that it was the hardest thing she had ever built in her life, and that she had been waiting for 9 years for the right person to walk through the door of Vespre on a Saturday night so that she could offer them a place in it. She told her that she thought that person was Shanice. Shanice stared at her. She did not speak for a long time. She looked down at Zuri, who was looking up at Geneva with wide, curious eyes. She looked at the business card in her hand. She looked at the woman in the gray coat. "Why me?" she finally asked. Geneva smiled. It was the first real smile Shanice had seen in that entire evening. "Because," she said, "I have watched a great many people walk out of a great many rooms in my life. And I have never seen anybody walk out of one with more dignity than you did just now. You did not shout. You did not beg. You did not bend. You just walked. And you held your daughter's hand, and you kept your chin up. And I have been looking for that woman for a very long time." Shanice did not answer right away. She looked down at Zuri. Zuri looked up at her. "Mommy, say yes." And Shanice smiled, and she looked at Geneva Hart, and she said, "Yes." The Second Table kitchen was in a converted warehouse on the north side of Charleston, in a part of town that had once been full of shipping crates and empty lots and was now full of coffee shops and art studios. The building was long and low, with tall windows and a red brick facade, and a small sign above the door that said, in simple black letters, "Second Table." Shanice arrived at 5:30 in the morning on her first day. She was wearing a white chef's coat that Geneva had given her the week before, and on the left breast of that coat, embroidered in small blue letters, was her name, Shanice Odom. She had spent an hour that morning just looking at it in the mirror. She had never owned a piece of clothing with her name on it before. Geneva was waiting for her at the door. She was holding 2 cups of coffee. She handed one to Shanice. "You ready?" she asked. "No," Shanice said. Geneva laughed. "Good. If you were ready, I would not have picked you." She led Shanice into the kitchen, and what Shanice saw took her breath away. It was the biggest kitchen she had ever been in. It was spotless. It was silent. It was beautiful. Rows of stainless steel counters, racks of copper pots, shelves of spices in glass jars with handwritten labels, a wall of knives, each one held in place by a magnetic strip, each one sharpened to a mirror shine. "This," Geneva said, "is where you are going to spend the next 12 months of your life. You are going to work harder than you have ever worked. You are going to fail more than you have ever failed. You are going to cry. You are going to want to quit. You are going to think that I made a mistake in choosing you. And every single time you think that, I want you to remember one thing. Are you listening?" Shanice nodded. Geneva took her hand. She squeezed it. "The sauce does not care how many times you fail. It only cares whether you come back to the stove." The first month at Second Table was the hardest month of Shanice's life. Harder than the year she was pregnant. Harder than the winter the heat wet out. Harder than the summer she worked 3 jobs to keep Zuri in daycare. Geneva Hart was a small woman, but she ran her kitchen the way an admiral runs a fleet. There was no yelling. There was no cursing. There was only the quiet, relentless, unforgiving expectation of excellence. Shanice learned to make stock, real stock from real bones simmered for 18 hours. She learned to make a bechamel that did not break. She learned to fillet a fish in under 30 seconds. She learned to fold an omelet without tearing the skin. She learned to hold a knife the way a surgeon holds a scalpel. She learned to season with her fingers instead of her eyes. She burned herself. She cut herself. She dropped a tray of tarts on the floor and stood over them for a full minute before Geneva quietly handed her a broom and said, "Sweep it up. Make another batch. Do not apologize. Do not explain. Just cook." She went home every night at 10. She kissed Zuri, who was almost always already asleep. She sat at the kitchen table with a cup of tea. And she wrote in her notebook. But she did not write down dollars anymore. She wrote down recipes. She wrote down techniques. She wrote down the things Geneva had said to her that day. And she wrote down, at the top of every page, in careful blue ink, the same 6 words. The sauce does not care. Zuri was 7 years old, and she noticed everything. She noticed that her mother came home tired but happy. She noticed that her mother's hands had new cuts on them, but that her mother did not seem to mind. She noticed that her mother had started humming in the mornings, which was a thing she had never done before. One night, Zuri was sitting at the kitchen table doing her homework, and Shanice was standing at the stove making dinner. Shanice was making a simple soup, but she was making it the way Geneva had taught her, with real stock, and with vegetables cut to a precise size, and with a bay leaf that she had toasted in a dry pan first. Zuri looked up from her homework. "Mommy," she said, "you smell different." "I smell different?" "You smell like the kitchen, Like a real kitchen. Like a fancy kitchen. Shanice laughed. Is that a good smell or a bad smell? Zuri thought about it very seriously. She was 7, but she had the seriousness of a small judge. It's a good smell, she finally said. It smells like you're happy. Shanice put down her spoon. She walked over to the table. She knelt down. She put her hand on her daughter's cheek. Baby, she said, I am happy. I am so happy. And she was. While Shanice was learning to cook, Vespre was beginning to fall apart. The problem, as Donovan Price would tell you later, was not one thing. It was many small things, all of which he ignored, all of which added up to something very large. The head chef quit in April, after a screaming match with Victoria over a shipment of oysters. The pastry chef quit in May, after being asked to work a double shift on her wedding anniversary. 3 line cooks quit in June, because they had been offered better pay at a new place across town. And in July, the sous chef quit, without notice, in the middle of a Saturday night service. Walking out through the back door in the middle of a dinner rush and leaving Donovan Price to stand in the kitchen in his tailored suit with his mouth open and his phone in his hand. The food began to slip. The reviews began to slip. The regulars began to notice. A well-known food critic wrote an article in the Charleston paper in August that used the words tired, arrogant, and coasting on reputation. Reservations began to drop. Tables that had once been booked 6 weeks in advance were now available on Saturday nights with 2 days' notice. And Donovan Price, who had inherited Vespre from his father and had never once cooked a single dish in the kitchen he owned, began to panic. He fired Victoria in September. He hired a new general manager. He hired a new head chef. He fired the new head chef in November. He hired another one in December. Nothing worked. The bones of the restaurant were rotting from the inside, and every new hire could feel it the moment they walked through the door. By January, Donovan Price was desperate. And that was when Geneva Hart called him. Geneva Hart had known Donovan Price for a very long time. She had known his father, and she had known him when he was a young man in his 20s, before he inherited the restaurant, before he learned how to talk down to people who worked for a living. She did not particularly like him, but she had once done him a favor many years ago, and he owed her one in return. She called him on a Tuesday morning in January. She told him she had a chef for him. She told him the chef was young and talented and hungry, and would work harder than anybody he had ever employed. She told him the chef had trained under her personally for the last 12 months. And she told him that if he trusted her, and if he hired this chef, sight unseen, on her recommendation alone, she would consider his debt to her paid in full. Donovan Price was so desperate that he agreed on the phone. He did not even ask for the chef's name. "When can she start?" he asked. "Monday," Geneva said. "Send her over." "I will." And Geneva Hart hung up the phone. She stood at the window of her office at second table. She looked out over the parking lot, and she smiled a smile that had been 11 months and 1 week in the making. On the Friday before her first day at Vespre, Shanice Odom stood in Geneva Hart's office. She was holding a new chef's coat in her hands. It was white. It was heavier than the one she had been wearing at second table. It was pressed. It was clean. And on the left breast, embroidered in dark blue letters, were the words, "Head Chef," and underneath that, Shanice Odom. Shanice looked at Geneva. Geneva looked back at her. "I want you to know something," Geneva said. "I did not tell Donovan Price your name. I did not tell him what you look like. I did not tell him where you have worked before. He does not know that you are the woman he threw out of his restaurant 1 year ago. He is going to find out on Monday morning when you walk through his door. And I want you to be ready for that." Shanice nodded. "I also want you to know," Geneva said, "that you do not owe him anything. You do not owe him a smile. You do not owe him an apology. You do not owe him a single word about what happened that night. You owe him one thing and one thing only. You owe him the best food he has ever tasted in his life. And once he has tasted it, he is going to know exactly who you are. And it is going to be too late for him to say a single word about it." Shanice smiled. It was a small smile, but it was real. "I understand," she said. Geneva reached out. She smoothed the collar of the coat. "You are going to walk through the back door on Monday morning," she said. "You are going to walk into that kitchen. You are going to stand at the main stove. And you are going to cook. Not from a book, not from a recipe. From here." She tapped Shanice's chest. "From everything you remember. From every meal you ever made for your daughter. From every meal you ever went without. Do you understand me?" "Yes." "Then go home. Kiss your daughter. Get some sleep. And I will see you on the other side." Shanice walked out of that office holding her coat over her arm like it was a newborn baby. She walked home in the cold January sunshine. And when she got home, she hung the coat on the back of the kitchen door, and she stood in front of it for a long time, and she did not say a word. Zuri came in from her bedroom. She looked at the coat. She looked at her mother. "Mommy," she said, "is that yours?" "Yes, baby." "It has your name on it." "Yes, baby." Zuri walked over to the coat. She reached up. She touched the embroidered letters with the tip of her finger, very carefully, as if she were afraid they would come off. "Mommy," she said, "you did it." And Shanice knelt down, and she pulled her daughter close, and she pressed her face into her daughter's hair. And she said, "No, baby, we did it." Shanice Odom arrived at the back door of Vespre at 4:55 in the morning on Monday, January the 22nd. She was wearing her new coat under a dark wool jacket. She was carrying a small canvas bag with her knives in it. She was alone. The back door of Vespre opened onto a small alley behind the restaurant, next to a row of green dumpsters and a stack of empty wooden crates. The door was heavy, and it was gray, and it had a small square window in it that was covered with a piece of yellowing paper. Shanice stood in front of that door for a long moment. She thought about the last time she had walked out of Vespre. She thought about the sidewalk. She thought about her daughter's hand in hers. She thought about Geneva Hart standing under the street lamp. Then she raised her hand, and she knocked. The door was opened by a young line cook named Marcus, who did not know who she was, and who did not particularly care. He was tired. He was hungover. He had been told that a new head chef was starting that morning, and he had assumed it was going to be another one of the tall, loud, angry men that Donovan Price had been hiring and firing for the last 6 months. He looked at Shanice. He looked at her coat. He looked at her canvas bag, and he said, "You the new chef?" "Yes." "You want some coffee?" "Yes, please." Marcus stepped aside. Shanice walked in. She walked through the back hallway, past the walk-in freezer, past the dry storage room, past the small closet where the aprons were kept. And she walked into the kitchen of Vespre for the first time in her life. The kitchen was quiet. It was empty. The lights had been turned on, but not brought up to full brightness. The stainless steel counters gleamed. The pots hung in their racks. The stove, which was a long, black, six-burner beast that had been imported from France, sat at the center of the room like an altar. Shanice walked over to that stove. She set down her canvas bag. She took off her wool jacket. She hung it on a hook by the door, and she stood at the stove, in her white coat with her name on it, and she placed both of her hands on the cold black surface. And she took a breath. And then she began to cook. The first service at Vespre under Chef Shanice Odom was, according to everybody who was there that night, unlike anything the restaurant had ever seen. She did not change the menu, not on the first night. She cooked the same dishes that had been on the menu the week before, but she cooked them the way Geneva had taught her. Which is to say, she cooked them with intention. She cooked them with memory. She cooked them with the understanding that food was a language, and that every plate she sent out of that kitchen was a sentence that somebody was going to read with their mouth. The roasted chicken was seasoned with a spice blend Shanice had learned from her grandmother, who had learned it from her grandmother. The pasta was tossed with a butter that had been browned to the exact color of a copper penny. The soup, which had been on the menu for 11 years and which nobody had ever ordered twice, was reworked in the space of a single afternoon into something that a woman at table 12 began to cry over halfway through her second spoonful. The reviews, when they came, were the kind of reviews that restaurants dream about. The food critic who had used the words tired and arrogant 6 months earlier now used the words revelatory, electric, and quietly, devastatingly personal. Reservations began to come back. Then they began to flood in. By the end of the second month, Vespre was booked 8 weeks in advance for the first time in its history. And on a Saturday night in March, at table 7, sipping quietly from a glass of red wine, Geneva Hart looked up. And she watched a young black woman in a white coat walk out of the kitchen and into the dining room, holding the hand of her 7-year-old daughter. And Shanice Odom walked her daughter across that dining room, past the fireplace and the fresh flowers, to a table by the window, and she pulled out a chair, and she sat her daughter down, and she leaned down, and she kissed her daughter on the forehead, and she whispered something in her ear that nobody else could hear. And Zuri Odom, who was now 8 years old, who was wearing a pale yellow dress with tiny white flowers embroidered along the hem, unfolded a small piece of paper on which she had written, in careful purple crayon letters, the words, "Mommy's Restaurant." And she looked up at her mother, and she smiled. Donovan Price found out who Shanice Odom was on her third day of work. He had come into the kitchen in the middle of the afternoon, between lunch and dinner service, when the kitchen was quiet and the staff was on break. He had come in to introduce himself, properly, which was something he had not bothered to do on her first day, because he had been in a meeting, and then on her second day, because he had been playing golf. He walked into the kitchen. He saw her standing at the stove, stirring a pot of stock. She had her back to him. He said, "Chef Odom, I don't believe we've been formally introduced." She turned around, and Donovan Price, who had spent 36 years perfecting the particular kind of smile that a man in his position was expected to wear, felt that smile freeze on his face. He remembered her. He did not remember her name. He did not remember the details. But he remembered her face. He remembered the navy blue dress. He remembered the little girl with the yellow ribbons in her hair. He remembered Victoria whispering in his ear at the bar 1 year and 1 month ago that she had taken care of a situation in the dining room. And he remembered nodding, without looking, without asking, without caring. And now that face was standing in his kitchen, in a white coat, with her name on it, and she was looking at him. And she was not smiling. "Mr. Price?" Shanice said. Her voice was calm. Her voice was steady. Her voice was the voice of a woman who had rehearsed this moment in her head for 365 nights. "Chef Odom," he managed. "Was there something you needed?" He opened his mouth. He closed it. He opened it again. He looked at the pot of stock. He looked at the knives on the wall. He looked at her coat. He looked at her face. "No," he finally said. "No. I just wanted to say, welcome to Vespre." "Thank you." He stood there for another moment. He looked like a man who wanted to say something else, who wanted to say a great many other things, who wanted to explain or apologize or excuse or ask or beg. But Shanice Odom had already turned back to her stove, and she had already picked up her spoon, and she had already begun to stir. And Donovan Price stood in that kitchen for a long, long moment. And then he turned around, and he walked out, and he closed the door quietly behind him. 2 weeks after Donovan Price walked out of that kitchen, a letter arrived at the back door of Vespre. It was addressed to Chef Shanice Odom. It was written on cream-colored stationery. It was sealed with a small drop of red wax. Shanice opened it in her office. She read it twice, and then she folded it very carefully, and she put it in the top drawer of her desk. The letter was from Donovan Price. It was not an apology. He was not the kind of man who knew how to write an apology. But it was, in its own strange and clumsy way, an acknowledgement. It said in 3 short paragraphs that he remembered the night, that he had been wrong, that he had done nothing to stop it and had, in fact, made the decision that led to it, and that if she wanted him to leave the restaurant, if she wanted him to sell his share, if she wanted him to disappear entirely from her life, he would do so, without argument, and he would consider it a debt paid. Shanice thought about that letter for a long time. She thought about it while she cooked. She thought about it while she rode the bus home. She thought about it while she watched Zuri sleep. And on a Sunday morning, sitting at her kitchen table with a cup of tea, she took out a pen and a piece of paper, and she wrote back. Her letter was 1 paragraph long. It said the following: "Mr. Price, I do not want you to leave the restaurant. I do not want you to sell your share. I do not want you to disappear. What I want is for you to stay. What I want is for you to come into the kitchen once a week. What I want is for you to watch. Watch me. Watch my staff. Watch the food. Watch the dining room. Watch every single person who walks through that door, whether they are wearing a suit or a bus uniform, whether they arrive in a car or on foot. And I want you to remember every single time that you almost missed all of it. Sincerely, Chef Shanice Odom." She sealed the letter. She mailed it on Monday morning. And on Wednesday afternoon, Donovan Price walked into the kitchen of Vespre, without a suit, without a smile, without a word. And he stood in the corner by the walk-in freezer, and he watched. And he came back the next Wednesday, and the Wednesday after that, and every Wednesday for the next 4 years. On the Saturday night that marked the 1-year anniversary of Shanice Odom's first service at Vespre, the restaurant was fully booked, as it had been for every Saturday night in the 11 months prior. The dining room was warm. The candles were lit. The fireplace was crackling. The flowers were fresh. At table 7, Geneva Hart was sitting alone, sipping quietly from a glass of red wine. She was wearing the same dark gray coat she had worn on the night that had begun everything. She was watching the dining room the way she always watched the dining room, which was to say, quietly, patiently, and with the eyes of a woman who was always looking for the next person who reminded her of her mother. At a table by the window, Shanice Odom, who was now 8, was doing her homework. She had a small plate of buttered pasta in front of her, and a glass of milk, and a red pencil that she was using to underline the important parts of her spelling list. Miss Thelma was sitting across from her, drinking a cup of coffee, and smiling in the way that only a retired school teacher can smile when she watches a child do her homework properly. In the kitchen, Shanice Odom stood at her stove. Her white coat was pressed. Her name was on her chest. Her knives were sharp. And in her hand was a wooden spoon that Geneva Hart had given her on her last day at second table. Engraved along the handle with 6 small words in careful blue ink. The sauce does not care. And Shanice Odom, who had once walked out of this dining room in a navy blue dress with her daughter's hand in hers, and who had once cried on a sidewalk under a street lamp, and who had once believed for a single terrible moment that there were rooms in this world she was not allowed to walk into, stood at her stove in the kitchen of the finest restaurant in Charleston, South Carolina, and she began to cook. Not from a book, not from a recipe, from here, from every meal she remembered, from every meal she had gone without, from every moment she had ever spent standing over a stove in a small, yellow-walled diner off Highway 17, chopping onions until her fingers went numb. From every night she had ever sat at her kitchen table with a notebook and a cup of tea that was more hot water than tea. From every promise she had ever made to a small girl in a pale yellow dress with tiny white flowers embroidered along the hem. She cooked from all of it. And in the dining room, at a table by the window, her daughter looked up from her homework. And she looked across the room, and she caught her mother's eye through the small round window in the kitchen door. And she smiled. And Shanice Odom smiled back. And the sauce, which did not care how many times she had failed, and did not care how many times she had come back to the stove, and did not care about anything at all except whether she cooked it with everything she had left in her heart, began, very quietly, to simmer.